PMS. If that sounds familiar to you, it should. It's getting more and more attention every day. PMS stands for premenstrual syndromes. And today's show is hopefully going to explain to you all about PMS. Stay tuned. The ladies here in my studio are very well acquainted with PMS. They've been speaking on that for months. I'd like to introduce them to you now. Dr. Jean Hamilton is a psychiatric researcher involved in the PMS research going on currently at the National Institute of Health in Bethesda, Maryland. Barbara Newman is with the District Attorney's Office in New York, in Brooklyn, New York. Stephanie Benson is an attorney with the Legal Aid Society of New York City, and Elaine Cliff is chair of the Women's Health Roundtable, and she has also served on numerous other women's health group committees and is very, very knowledgeable in many of the aspects of women's health in the United States. All right, ladies, I'm going to start out with Dr. Hamilton because I want a good, general, broad definition of PMS. And who better to start with than a researcher doing research on PMS for the National Institute of Health. And Jean, we're going to call each other by first names. We're going to be really informal here. Jean is going to give me a definition of PMS, including symptoms, the research being conducted now at NIH, and some of the treatments that are currently being used. And of course, if any of you other ladies are familiar with treatment or symptoms or things that are not brought out, we're going to jump right in here and have a nice roundtable discussion because we want to inform you out there of what's going on so you can form your own opinion. Okay, Jean, now, what is a nice general definition of premenstrual syndrome?
Okay. To begin with, let me say I'm a medical doctor and I'm trained in psychiatry. For the last 3 years, I've been working in the area of menstrual-related mood and behavior changes at the National Institute of Mental Health. And when I began doing work in that area, it came out of a concern for women's health issues. And back in the 1930s, a physician named Frank said that there was a constellation of symptoms that some women have, which he defined as being premenstrual syndrome. And the kinds of symptoms that go into this kind of syndrome have to do with anything from pain, breast tenderness, swelling, to nausea or dizziness, to a variety of mood and behavior changes. And most often people have focused in on the kind of mood changes that have to do with, say, irritability or tension, and hence this has often been called premenstrual tension disorder. I think that in the years since Frank first made this observation, that we really have made very little progress in understanding the kinds of experiences that so many women do have in relation to their menstrual cycles. And that's one of the reasons why I began my research. And in fact, I developed the first research project on mood and behavior changes, menstrual-related changes at the National Institute of Mental Health. And I think that the work that we're doing is still really at the forefront, that we're just beginning to make inroads into this very difficult area of research. And I hope that this area of inquiry will be continued because I think that it is important for women.
Okay, let me break in for a second. Now, you are the person who then initiated the study at NIH dealing with premenstrual syndrome?
Yes.
And you actually initiated this study almost 2 years ago?
Yeah,
the very beginning.
Yeah, 2.5 years ago.
Okay, now research is going on right now. In fact, a friend of mine is involved in it. And her research, her part of the research just started, I guess, about 3 or 4 months ago, where she had to fill out forms, and she said it's in 3 phases. Can you describe what kind of research is going on in the double-blind testing and all of that, and what you're hoping at NIH to achieve with this testing?
Well, let me say there are a number of researchers in this area now at the National Institute of Mental Health. And for some reason, it hasn't worked out that the projects are very collaborative. But the kind of work that I've been doing, which is similar in some ways to that of some of the other investigators, is really kind of a broad psychobiological look at women's experience in relation to different phases of the menstrual cycle. And we're doing clinical, behavioral, and biological evaluations throughout the menstrual cycle. And part of this is really focused on the basic underlying endocrinology and neurochemistry of the menstrual cycle. And part of it has to do with trying to clarify just what relationship, if anything, premenstrual symptoms have to do with other psychiatric disorders or diagnostic categories. And I think that question right now is totally up for grabs. I think that it's totally unclear right now what that relationship might be.
You know, PMS sounds like a catch-all phrase to me. And it might well be that it is right now. Do you think that, now how long will this research be going on? Explain what double-blind testing is.
Okay, well, maybe I could hold off on that for a minute. Let me give you some idea of just where we are in terms of asking research questions and sort of the state-of-the-art knowledge. Basically, in order to begin to research a given question, you have to be able to clearly define what you're talking about. And I think that this is where we get into that kind of grab bag issue, that in fact we're talking about a collection of symptoms, none of which are necessarily specific to women or to the menstrual cycle. So that when in the beginning I gave you examples of some of the symptoms, men have nausea. Women have nausea at various times in their menstrual cycles, not only premenstrually. And the same goes for really all of the other kinds of symptoms, as well as perhaps some of the groups of symptoms. And I think this is a very important point.
So you're trying to weed out what is truly dealing with the menstrual cycle and what could be just coming from any other source.
And where we're at right now is that menstrual cycle phases have not clearly been shown to have any specific effects on mood and behavior. For every report that claims that women have, say, increased sexuality around the time of ovulation, there are an equal number of reports that it's indeed decreased then or else totally unrelated. So I think that goes not only for premenstrual symptoms, but for other times of the cycle as well. Now, getting back to the issue of beginning research, we have to clarify and define what it is we're talking about. And I think it's very important at this point to state that in terms of the official diagnostic classifications used by the American Psychiatric Society, that premenstrual syndrome is not currently part of any diagnostic system that we have. That in fact at this time the only place where premenstrual symptoms are recognized or legitimized as being part of a diagnostic scheme is in the hospital, the International Hospital Diseases classification system, and there it occurs only as a gynecologic diagnosis, not as a psychiatric diagnosis. On the other hand, certain researchers have put forward what we term research diagnostic criteria to begin to clarify whether there might be, in fact, for some women, some kind of psychiatric entity, really focusing in on the negative moods that some women experience premenstrually. But again, I think you have to really underline that this is research,
So nothing's been
not
proven.
clinical, no. And that these research criteria remain to be validated, that we're only at the beginning of exploring these criteria and these definitions.
And so how long do you think that this NIH study will last?
Well, I think that this kind of work is very difficult, very costly, and very time-consuming, and that the kinds of studies that we need will have to extend over periods of 3 to 5 years. You know, as I say, I've been working for maybe 2.5 years, and some of the other groups in San Diego, Michigan, New York.
California also, I believe, is
Yeah,
there's a doctor out there who's developed a vitamin therapy.
Yeah, that this work will really have to be tested for long periods of time. Now, again, in terms of my research, my reading of where we're at in terms of beginning really corresponds, I think, to the viewpoints of a lot of major investigators. And that is that we're really not at the point currently of pushing any particular therapy, precisely because we don't understand, and we can barely even define and specify, you know, the entity and the duration. There's total disagreement. It's totally random as to whether people
Would you all
say,
agree there's total disagreement in all fields dealing with women as to what PMS is?
Yeah, I mean,
I have gotten such mixed comments.
Some researchers count forward in the menstrual cycle, some count backwards, some don't define cycle phase in terms of days. Some say premenstrual syndrome occurs 4 days before the period, others up to 2 weeks.
Yeah, sure.
So this is all the target of discussion currently in the scientific community. And I do want to add that the National Institute of Mental Health is currently sponsoring, or will soon be sponsoring, a nationwide workshop where they're having the leaders in scientific investigation come together and really think critically and begin to define the kinds of questions we need to ask, the kinds of methodologies we need to use, the kinds of rating scales, the kinds of measures. And what this indicates is that we're merely at the beginning.
It also indicates that there is serious interest, that we recognize that there is something that women, a general amount of women go through
I think
on a periodic basis.
That's a very important point. I think all of us here as women can remember back and are certainly aware that the medical profession has had a tendency in the past to overlook some of the experiences of women patients.
You get a pat on the head, and a Valium is what you get, typically.
Sure.
Right? Am I right? How many people here have had cramps or nausea or irritability and gone to the doctor and said, what's the matter with me? I'm so angry all the time, and I'm not like this usually, but for some reason I can't control myself right now. What is going on? And the doctor says, oh, here, take this prescription and have it filled and you'll feel better. How many of us have
or
had
just a general minimization, you know,
Right.
it's just your period, it's just premenstrual,
Yeah,
it's just, you know.
It's trivialized.
Or how many
right.
hysterectomies
Oh,
or
my-
shock therapy treatments or other things that are more serious, people who've just been isolated and perhaps had their lives disrupted, their families disrupted, instead of
That's
seeking
right.
counseling. If in this fact we can't get the medical knowledge that we need, at least you said people recognize that maybe the counseling would be enough therapy.
I attended a Food and Drug Administration meeting on this subject not too long ago, and one of the speakers spoke of one of the treatment of clitoral removal as a possible treatment, and there was shared disbelief.
Or lobotomy. One person she mentioned had been lobotomized.
Right. Oh, no.
Oh, no.
Well, I think the problem has been that women's experiences have either been dismissed and trivialized as if women who have these sorts of complaints are either hysterical or neurotic, or else there has been this kind of overreaction in the other direction, that, well, these problems are really very serious, and in fact they're virtually incapacitating for all women, that really all women are in some way at risk for these kinds of severe disorders. And that's simply not true. What we do know, granted that we know very little, what we do know, replicated firm findings have shown that perhaps 10 to 90% of all women can recognize in themselves and have reported very, very mild to minimal changes in some way related to their menstrual cycle, including perhaps premenstrually. What this means is yet to be determined. It's really not surprising that since most women on a day-to-day basis are in some phase of their menstrual cycle, that women would in some way relate something or other to the menstrual cycle. It's ubiquitous to our experience unless we're pregnant or menopausal or premenarchal.
But now, you as a psychiatrist, not to cut you off, I'm sorry, hold that. You as a psychiatrist now, you've treated men also, haven't you? You've not just dealt specifically with women all your life as a doctor.
No, of course not.
Men go through things too. What is this that women have this unusual characteristic, well, anytime during their menstrual cycle that they might have certain symptoms that lead them to be a little unusual or strange acting or whatever, which is what a lot of this is saying when you get right down to it.
You know, in beginning my work on the menstrual cycle, one of the things that I was struck by is the emphasis that's been given in biomedical science to cyclic phenomena that occur in women. Of course, it's readily apparent that women do have menstrual cycles, and I think that simply because it's so obvious and it's one of the easily observable differences biologically between men and women, that there has been a great deal of attention paid. On the other hand, it's well documented that men have, say, 20 to 22-day cycles of testosterone.
Oh, that's interesting.
Ironically, I was reading in Ms. Magazine an article on PMS written by a woman, Mary Parlee, and then I was, a couple weeks later, looking through a very old Psychology Today. It was at a doctor's office. It was August, I believe, 1978. And there she had written an article about 4 years earlier about men's cycles. And there were many citations at the end of the Psychology Today article. And she, of course, referred to, for example, in Japan, the flight schedules, which they try to regulate in terms of biorhythms of men. So there are all kinds of rhythms that people talk about.
Yeah, I mean, rhythms, daily rhythms, monthly rhythms, seasonal rhythms in basic physiological systems have received more and more attention in men and women. The curious thing is that when we look at these longer range cycles, 20, 30-day cycles, we tend to forget men. Clearly, it has been shown that men have longer rhythms.
We definitely forget men.
Men have longer rhythms as well. Furthermore, what really strikes me is that when we begin to focus in on one particular cycle phase for women, to really put our money on the premenstrual cycle phase, and really almost exclusively focus on negative experiences that occur at that time for some women. For example, irritability or aggression that may occur in women premenstrually. When you think back to these testosterone cycles in men and the almost total neglect since these initial reports of that area of research, you begin to recall some of these studies that testosterone may be linked to aggression. And you begin to wonder why all this focus, why all this attention on aggression in women when women commit perhaps less than 10% of violent crimes. And if we know that men have cycles, we also know that there may in fact for both men and women be around 28-day cycles
Gee, that's
in violent acts. This is in the literature, and yet for some reason, and I don't think it's too hard, you don't have to go too far to look for the reason, that we focus in on negative kinds of things for women. The reason clearly has to do with the pervasive myths and stereotypes and prejudices that have to do with women in our society, where women continue to have a subordinate role.
Very well put. Okay. Now, Barbara and Stephanie have worked very hard over the last year on a case that came up in New York State in Brooklyn. And I'm not going to go into the technicalities of that. I will let these two ladies do that for me because they were the ones directly involved, and we are in a different state now, and things do change from state to state legally. However, I'm going to ask Barbara, who works for the DA's office, to go into, very briefly, what the procedure is when someone has committed a crime and it is reported. So do that, Barbara. Then we're going to go to Stephanie and find out the nitty-gritty of the case. And we're going to kind of go back and forth here to give you an idea, because the case ties in directly with PMS, but I'm going to let them tell you how. First of all, Barbara, what happens in Brooklyn when somebody commits a crime and the police report it to the DA's office? What kind of things happen?
The witnesses, after the defendant is arrested, the witnesses come to our office and we evaluate the case. We subpoena medical records and gather all of the evidence that's available in the case, which we did in this case. And the defendant in the case, Ms. Santos, was arrested, and the charges were shortly thereafter reduced to a misdemeanor level. And throughout the course of the case, which was the first one in the United States in which someone asserted, in a way that we assert is hollow, the fact that premenstrual syndrome relieves women of criminal responsibility. The case proceeded as a misdemeanor until finally the defendant pled guilty to harassment, which is an intentional act, which is the core of the outcome of the case, because the outcome of premenstrual syndrome is I'm not responsible because of premenstrual syndrome. This defendant pled guilty to an intentional act. She admitted on the record that she was responsible for her acts, and she withdrew all of her defenses. So the bottom line of the case is that there was no evidence given on premenstrual syndrome, there was no testimony given on premenstrual syndrome, it was not accepted as a legitimate defense, and it played no part whatsoever in the outcome, except that the defendant admitted her responsibility, which is totally contrary to the thought of premenstrual syndrome, and she withdrew all her defenses, and she even went on television and said she didn't hit her child because she had just gotten her period.
Okay, let me get back to the original question, though. The police arrest the person,
right,
however they come to find out about the crime. That person's name is turned in to the DA's office. The DA's office gets the person. They have to fill out a bunch of papers. You subpoena all kinds of records, because you are then become the prosecutor.
Correct.
Right?
Correct.
And then you have a court hearing and decide whether to bring the case to trial. Is that how it works?
It depends on the type of case. If it's a felony, then there's a grand jury proceeding. If it's a misdemeanor, which this became, there's just no grand jury proceeding. It's a parallel proceeding. The police have custody of the defendant, and the DA has custody of the case, so to speak, prosecuting the case. We don't physically take custody of the defendant. The police are independent of the district attorney's office.
Okay. Now, Stephanie, you were the defense attorney for this case.
My name is Stephanie Benson, and I work for the Legal Aid Society in Brooklyn. I defend poor people. In this case, it was December of 1981. I was assigned to arraignments for the day. Arraignments are the first court appearance of the defendant. I had a woman who was extraordinarily upset. She was young, 24, black, distraught, crying, in bedclothes in the middle of the winter, and kept asking about how her child was. Well, I looked at the file.
Was this a phone conversation?
No, this was face-to-face.
How did she get to you?
She was brought in by the police, and I'm in the courtroom, and I go in the back into the holding pens and interview.
Okay, so she'd already been through all the DA procedure.
And she said to me 3 things which stuck in my mind, and really only 3 sentences. She said, I didn't mean to hit my child, which she was accused of doing. I don't remember what happened. I just got my period. Well, there's a very important thing to remember. In every criminal case, the charges, each and every element of each charge, must be proven beyond a reasonable doubt. The burden is never on the defense. And in each charge, no matter what the crime, there have to be 2 elements. One is a criminal intent, and one is a criminal act. And in order for there to be a criminal act, it's not just an act. the act must be voluntary, and it must be conscious, and it must be willed, a willed voluntary act. By virtue of the fact that she said, I didn't intend to hurt my child, she was clearly saying to me that she lacked criminal intent. And if, in fact, that were not proven beyond a reasonable doubt that she intended to hurt her child, that's enough for an acquittal. But in this case, it sounded like both elements were missing because she said, I don't remember. And that recalled to me law school, which was automatism defenses and unconsciousness defenses. So now I was looking at a case that not only was it possibly weak on one aspect, the criminal intent, but that there was this entire thing about a criminal act because she didn't remember. The only piece that didn't fit was this piece about her period. Well, she was released at that day, and she came back to my office, and she came back to my office a few times in the next couple of weeks, and she kept telling me, in trying for me to get the story, these medical and psychological symptoms. In fact, I was sort of impatient, I'd have to admit to you. I was like, just tell me what happened. She was like, I don't remember. I hadn't eaten but a very light dinner the night before. I ate no breakfast. I ate no lunch. I was feeling faint. I was feeling ill. I told my children to please lay down. I had to please leave me alone. I had to lay down.
Okay, let me stop you for a second. I have got 2 questions I must ask.
You ask.
Okay, to clarify this. Number 1, when did this act occur in her menstrual cycle? Did you?
She had just gotten her period.
So it didn't happen.
She had just gotten it like the evening before.
So it didn't happen the week or 2 before, which is PMS.
Well,
PMS tends to say.
Oftentimes people look at a period of between, 3 to 4 days before. But, the eve of the menstrual cycle certainly, might fit within that premenstrual time. I think the issue is this, that we know for a fact that stress can either precipitate or delay the menstrual cycle, and therefore the association of any kind of behavioral act with the menstrual cycle may not be causal at all. It may be that the act or the stresses that led up to the act may bring on the cycle, and that the only way to clarify that issue would be to do large-scale epidemiologic studies where you looked at all women within a large group who committed criminal acts or any kind of violent act, and then identified precisely by some objective way where they were in their menstrual cycle, and whether where they were was earlier or later than you might have expected. And you would also have to compare the group of women who committed these acts with the entire group of all other women in the same period of time who did not commit any similar act, and look at where they were in their cycles, because it is just not correct to assume that all women have an equal chance of being at a particular place in their cycle. Stress can bring on the period.
Okay, then I hold your thoughts a second. I hope you bring that up at this meeting that's going to come up. Okay?
Certainly.
That is a big point. Now that this case has, hold your thought.
Second question.
I know. Let me see what Barbara's
Because
going
one
to
of
say.
the factors about where a woman is, it's so crucial where a woman is in her cycle to ascertain what relationship, if any, there is between her behavior and her cycle. One of the studies I read had the researcher, in a way that they didn't spell out, convince the subjects, the women, that they were at a place in their cycle other than they actually physiologically were, and their behavior conformed to their expectations of where she convinced them that they were, rather than where they physiologically were. So I agree with the doctor.
It's a very
This
powerful
is a
study.
very good point. Remember that out there. Now, second question. How well educated was this woman? How much did you think she knew about
My
PMS
client
up front?
can't read. She was 24 years old and the unwed mother of 6.
Oh, okay.
She was housebound, and in fact, one of the big aspects of PMS is the stress. Stress is a cerebral stimuli which can increase the severity of these symptoms. And in fact, let's say that I have children and I'm feeling premenstrual. I would, at my standard of living, take my children to the daycare center while I went and played racquetball and then went to a movie and out to dinner, and I would feel okay the next day.
Because you can afford it.
Because I can afford it, and because I can read and I have hobbies to sublimate, and I'm not going to perhaps touch my children, no matter what. No matter what. I just have control devices through school and through graduate school and through a job that I know that no matter what, I'm not going to. But you take your clients as you find them, and every person deserves to be judged separately. But if I could continue.
Yeah, go
so
ahead.
she was, as she described it for me, it sounded like perhaps spontaneous hypoglycemia, which is low blood sugar and which is oftentimes connected with the menstrual cycle. In fact, during a woman's perimenstruum, which is the first 4 days of preceding her period and the first 4 days of her period, apparently the blood sugar tolerance level is raised such that it's easier to go below it. And women feeling bloated and fat, that's when they tend not to eat, and they don't, you know, if they feel nauseous or backaches.
How many of us have felt that way? Seriously, be honest. Elaine, you're not saying anything.
Backaches.
How many of us have felt a high energy level right before a period, the bloatiness, and you really don't eat quite as much, or you don't eat it as well as you should? Have any of you experienced that? I know I have.
I get
I
bloated.
identify
regularly.
with some
I have
some
the
of the
opposite. My syndrome before is exactly like a pregnancy. I have all the symptoms of pregnancy.
Oh my God.
Well, my client was describing to me these symptoms, and I thought, because I'm more familiar with hypoglycemia, and I'm aware that hypoglycemia has been used as a defense, and has been used successfully as a defense of unconsciousness and automatism, and that it causes hazy thinking, an impairment of willpower and the thought processes, can cause aggressiveness, and irrational or otherwise sort of abnormal behavior for a specific person. So I was thinking that it was perhaps hypoglycemia, and I sent her to a psychiatrist.
Why a psychiatrist?
Well, because she kept, as an attorney, I was getting a little impatient with her telling me again and again this constellation of, I was feeling fat, I didn't want to eat, my back was killing me, I was throwing up, I was nauseous. And she was telling me this, and I was like, can we please talk about the case? And she was like, I don't remember going to, she allegedly hit her child who allegedly had bruises. She said, I just don't remember, but I remember afterwards the child did say, Mommy, I hurt. And she said, what happened? And not remembering and not knowing if the child was hurt, she called 911, which is the emergency services, and allowed the police into her home and spoke to the nurse and went to the hospital where she was arrested. So I sent her to a psychiatrist, and I felt like I was in over my head. I'm an attorney, I'm not a doctor.
Right.
He said, she certainly has PMS. I treat a lot of women who have this. And I said, well,
Now,
I
is
don't
this
really
a-
know what you're talking about. But he said, well, there's a lot of studies on it. Around that time, the New York Times printed an article about PMS being used in England to allow women to get on probation, not as a complete defense to the actual crime, but after they either pled guilty or were convicted, to allow them to go on probation. So I started researching then. And I did find a big problem with, there are some people who say that once your period starts, you don't have any more symptoms like that. But that's
probably not true.
it goes like both ways. And my client did have this tremendous stress in her life, raising these 6 kids alone. And she was
there was
feeling
no
ill.
husband?
No, and she was feeling ill. And she was also, it seems to be, very sorry. She didn't seem to me like she had the criminal intent. So I was looking at 2 things, whether or not she intentionally committed this act, and I just had no motivation. There was no preparation to hit her kids. There was no
There was no record
motivation
of
there.
ever abusing
She has
another
no,
child?
she has no criminal record.
Okay.
And as to the second matter, as to a criminal act, I said, well, at least there is a doubt here. And all that, if the defense has any function at all, is to highlight a reasonable doubt. Now, since she was the only person there and her child being 4 is too young to testify, my question is, how is the district attorney's office going to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that she intentionally wanted and did hit her child, and that she was voluntary, in control, and conscious when she's the only one there? As to the charges,
I have to ask a question real fast because we're getting too far away. The doctor you chose to do the workup on her mentally, psychologically, was that someone that you always use?
No,
Or
I'd
was
never
that just
used
a
this
random
person.
doctor?
No, I never used this person before. I went into my supervisor and I said, I need a doctor, I need a psychiatrist. And I said, and I would like somebody who also testifies for the district attorney's office.
I was going to ask you, but next, Barbara, did you also use this doctor's testimony, or did you, or records, or
Let
did
me
you
say
find?
that we proceeded by subpoena to get the records of this doctor. And they resisted the subpoena. They did not conform with the subpoena, and they did not turn the records over. I don't want to go into the merits of this doctor, but I will tell you that we spoke to a number of experts in connection and preparation with the case. Speaking broadly, we also researched 3,000 medical periodicals in English and foreign languages. And that is Western European languages and Eastern European. We obviously didn't read them in the original Chinese, but translated. There was no scientific evidence as a result of any phase of the menses. Women lose control of themselves to the extent that they should be relieved of responsibility for their actions. That's what our case was about. Are you responsible or are you not responsible?
Okay, but in this case, there were
And she admitted that she was responsible.
There are two matters I want to talk about. One thing is, by the way, this doctor's office is in the criminal courthouse in Manhattan and is used by both sides.
You're lucky that he was for PMS, you know, that he knew about it and that he was willing to go out on the limb.
I sent her there. I had never met the man before.
Yes, so as long as you had...
I'd like to say that my client was charged at arraignments with a violent felony, which is a specific category of felonies, which are the harshest categories. That was dropped probably on the next court date to a misdemeanor, and there are two types of misdemeanors, an A and a B. She was charged with the highest level, an A. I made a motion to dismiss in the interest of justice, and we had a hearing on that where the judge allowed in all argument, and he said that, quote, inasmuch as eruptions of the mind are admissible evidence at trial, referring to the Hinckley case, which was going on at that time, why then should not proof of physiological eruptions of the body likewise not be admissible? And at that time, then, he adjourned the case for 6 months because there were family court proceedings to take away the custody of the children. He indicated that if the children were removed from the home, or as she later did, she voluntarily relinquished control.
Of all of them?
Of the children, yes. Then he would probably dismiss the case, but that he did allow in the evidence then. The district attorney's office objected to even arguing about it, but he allowed it in, and in fact, when asked by the New York Daily News to clarify his ruling, he said, quote, I ruled that it was an admissible defense. But in any case, it was during the period of that motion that I was making that the district attorney's office dropped it down to a B misdemeanor.
Right,
but I said that we would not plead guilty to any criminal act in this case. We wanted a trial. And as a matter of fact, as the case turned out, they offered a deal which was a very good deal and a very fair deal. They let her plead guilty to a violation. A violation is not a felony or a misdemeanor. That is, it's not a crime. A parking ticket is a violation. It is not a criminal conviction. So she did not get a criminal conviction. She was not fined. She was not incarcerated, and she was not put on probation.
Wait a second.
Which was I thought, a very fair way. Now, I wasn't there at the time that she actually pled guilty because legal aid was on strike, but she pled guilty, and that was that. As far as I know, there was no statements as to PMS one way or the other. And in fact, my client, I never spent time educating her about PMS because I didn't want it to appear rehearsed, and I didn't want her to become a little pseudo-medical expert. So I didn't discuss it with her. I felt like the case was best heard from her own lips in her own way. I never told her, you have PMS, you have to say this. I don't think that that's right. What she said without counsel, I can't tell you.
She did have counsel. She had your supervisor. Don't say that she didn't have counsel. I would just like to clarify one misstatement that Ms. Benson persists in making. There was never a hearing on premenstrual syndrome. Counselor made a motion. The judge denied the motion. She made oral argument. We did not. There was no evidence. There was no sworn testimony. There was no evidence.
But it was argument on the motion to dismiss.
Excuse me, let me just finish. And also, the plea minutes reflect, and it's on the record, and you know that, and you've acknowledged that in the past. I'm really a little shocked at your behavior. She admitted that she withdrew her defense of premenstrual syndrome and that she accepted responsibility for her actions.
I haven't seen that in any minutes, Barbara. If you have them ordered, I would love to have a copy to my office. I wasn't there because I was on strike, as I said, but I can tell you this, that I, as the attorney of record, until we went on strike, I never thought that PMS was without merit. In fact, I do believe that even if it's not a medical certainty, the key is that it is enough for reasonable doubt.
I see
and
what
if there's
you're
a
saying.
doubt for which you can give a reason, then there's a reason to bring that to trial. And I wasn't afraid to try it. I think people would have been anxious to hear it.
Let me clarify something then. So and Jean is over here chomping at the bit. So basically, PMS seemed to be at the root of this because the psychiatrist said he felt this woman had been going through this. And of course, PMS has not been proven, so there is a shadow there, but I'm not going to get into legalities, and I also don't want to hassle this point or get too tied up with legal jargons and what goes on. But it seems that the woman was sincerely sorry, and therefore both sides could see that. So, I mean, stop me if I'm wrong. Both sides could see this. They didn't see the point in putting her behind bars. She did have 6 children to raise alone. They did feel that it was better for her to give these children up for a while and let her get her act together, correct?
Yes.
So rather than kick her in the tail and put her in the can, so to speak, at the same time, they gave her a chance to rehabilitate, got her children away from that terrible atmosphere while she got her head together. And what is happening? Well, I won't get into what's happening right now. I want to know what happened with this. PMS was actually not used as a defense, but yet it was used as a defense.
It was used in argument, and the case ended in a plea bargain. The case ended with her pleading guilty to a violation, which is not a crime. That was the end of the case.
But she also admitted that she intentionally committed an act. In the heart of premenstrual syndrome is the thing is about you have to not blur premeditation with intent. Intent can be formulated simultaneously. In other words, if a woman is irritable because she's poor and has 6 kids, irrespective of her cycle, and she gets aggravated and she gets angry, and at the time she just raises her hand and smacks the kid, even though she didn't say, I'm going to smack him at 5. She, at the moment, when she's angry and she wants to hurt him, and even though she's overcome with contrition immediately, grief-stricken, horrified, at the moment she raised, it's not like someone else did it. At that moment, she's aggravated. Rage is not a defense. Lots of people kill people for crazy things, over fights over bar stools, fights over places in the gas line, and you're responsible. You're responsible.
But you see,
let's let Jean in here.
Yeah.
Okay,
Yes. You've been so
I don't want to speak to the legal issues in this particular case, but I do want to clarify a couple of things. One is that when a psychiatrist evaluates a person with respect to their behavior on a particular occasion, say, or as to their diagnoses, I want to make it clear that in order to make a psychiatric diagnosis, certain criteria must be met, and that those criteria are applied equally to men and to women. In our classification schemes, there is nothing that applies, specifically to women versus men. It's sex neutral. And in our diagnostic categories, we have never specified in particular stresses or, time of day, time of year, much less time of month. So that I think an individual must always be evaluated as to whether they meet or did, meet at some particular time these criteria, and that it's totally irrelevant to the diagnosis as to what time of the month it was. Any more than we know, for example, that with the crimes that men commit, that they're very often, heavily based on the weekend. We also know that for both men and women, the mood changes and behavior changes that accompany day of the week are greater than day of the month for women or men. People feel better on the weekend, and men commit more crimes on Friday night. And I think that if you start getting into cycles and excuses of cycles, you're going to get into a garbage bag of specific stress-related diagnoses. What would happen is we would end up with a meaningless classification system where the stress for one person of eating a Twinkie would be comparable to another person eating Godiva chocolates, would be comparable to men who ever committed a crime on the weekend versus the day of the week. And I think we would just really be creating a mess. So that is one point I wanted to make. Another point is, even though this case may not have been contingent or predicated on premenstrual syndrome per se, you referred to the physiologic basis. Now, I think what would be important there is to clarify that men or women may have hypoglycemia, and that this may be brought on by innumerable things, innumerable stresses for men or women, and that it need not be specified as being specific to the menstrual cycle. Just as men and women have epilepsy, and epilepsy can be brought on in some women, perhaps, premenstrually, but it can be brought on in men or women with enormous numbers of stresses, including strobe lights and discos. And if people were then to make a diagnosis of disco-induced epilepsy and excusing, it gets to be absurd. And I want to underscore the absurdity of what that would mean for
I would just
diagnosis
like to say
and
that
for the law.
the bottom line for the defense is this. Is there a criminal act? Is there criminal intent? Criminal intent was dealt with her statement. The criminal act, though, was it the product of free will? Because if an act is not the product of free will, if it is not a voluntary, conscious act, it is not a criminal act. And one of the essential elements that must be proven is missing. And the defendant is entitled, whether as a doctor or not you're comfortable with it, to an acquittal. In fact, my research showed cases in this country as well as in Canada, France, England, because I also researched other countries, that hypoglycemia, somnambulism, which is sleepwalking, epilepsy, fugues and amnesiatic fits after concussions have all been used successfully as defenses. And in fact, this is the one defense that has its own particular hysteria. It's not a PMS defense. It is a lack of one of the elements. And the reason is that it falls under the category of unconsciousness or automatism. Or it can also be semi-consciousness. It's just not full consciousness. Whether or not it has implications to anyone else, whether or not it sounds bad, if this woman's physiological symptoms interfered with her ability to act freely, or if she didn't remember it and the amnesia is used as a defense, then she's entitled to assert that defense. And unless that can be disproven beyond a reasonable doubt, she's entitled to an acquittal.
Let me ask something here. How many of us have children? Okay. How many of us have wanted to do this? I mean, not wanted to do it, but boy, you come so close. Not just once, but there seems to be, I mean, you know, enough times during the year, and you're surprised at yourself. You're shocked, you're humiliated. You don't want to hurt your child.
I'll tell you something on that point, though. One of the perils of research in this area, when researchers rely on retrospective recollections of the subject, the woman, how did you feel when you hit your child? One of the things that was brought out at the FDA conference was that a woman may remember that she hit her child and then she got her period. But she may not remember that 2 weeks before she also felt an identical rage, but because she didn't have this external unique event, that is the onset of her period, she forgot it, not intentionally. But the human mind doesn't have the ability to recollect total recall.
That's true.
So that without negating the fact that certain things may happen at that time, and without imputing bad motherhood to any of us, perhaps it happens another day.
Well, the other question is, what cycle phase are men in when they hit their kids?
Oh, yes. Oh, definitely.
That clearly no one is going to argue the point that, you know, certainly in courts of law, that it is recognized that there are certain states that in some way, you know, modify events. The point I'm trying to make is that I think we need not link that specifically, because we have no evidence by which to do that specifically for only women. As I said before, that if you want to make the argument of hypoglycemia, whatever, that should be made in and of itself.
In fact, that was going to be done in this case, because it seemed as much, in some ways, hypoglycemia as it did seem premenstrual stress syndrome. So the case isn't really, it's a misnomer to call it the PMS case.
I didn't want to call it that, yeah.
It was a question of her seeming to be out of control and not remembering, which was also consonant with hypoglycemia, and that would have been equally presented at the trial.
But I think that even the fact that it's come up as an issue, partly due to the cases in England, and there has been this kind of fuzziness about the nature of this case as well. And you mentioned earlier you didn't know where this hysteria came from, people's concern about this. And I want to address that in particular, because I think that there is the danger and the likelihood that if some subgroup of women who in some way are liable to commit aggressive or criminal acts, you know, become tagged, if that becomes tagged or linked in some way to a biological event peculiar to women, then I think people are going to ignore the fact that that says absolutely nothing about all women in general. Because, you know, stereotypes do not operate logically. That if we say that some women are not responsible for their actions and link that statement particularly to premenstrual times for women, well, we know that all women, virtually all women, are going to be premenstrual at some time or other. And the concern is this, that given the stereotypes and prejudices that exist in this society, that the generalization is going to be made, therefore, that all women, when they are premenstrual, are in some way liable or at greater risk for being aggressive or committing criminal acts, and that is simply not true. That is incorrect, but is a dangerous, dangerous stereotype. And I, for one, for example, would just like to suggest a hypothetical legal question, which would be, we do have a few women doctors in this country. Very few of them are in research, and we now know that the values of research investigators show up in their research. I mean, that's absolutely clear in the same way that values show up in therapy. We have very few women researchers. They're never promoted to senior level positions in our federal government. You know, virtually never from training fellowship positions, say at the National Institute of Health, the National Institute of Mental Health, virtually never compared to innumerable promotions from within. Positions are never advertised as well. But, you know, the women are never promoted. And I think this is cause for concern. The other point I want to make is that as a woman physician, and this is the hypothetical question, if women become known as not responsible for their acts and decisions when they're premenstrual, then I'd like to know what the implications would be for me as a woman physician who's responsible for the treatment of patients. I'd like to know if someone would then make the argument perhaps that I'm not liable for my decisions when I'm premenstrual, which I think would be absurd.
I think you have to prove anything. Allegations are never enough. And also,
no, the stereotype is powerful.
Well, what are we going to do? Put PMS back in the closet, or are you going to say we want research and that's what we're going to do?
Elaine?
We have to be honest about the issue and not, on one level, the notion of allowing premenstrual syndrome some legal significance, which it has no merit legally, and the doctor has indicated. Not yet. It has none now. If I may just say so. But the problem is that women may say, oh, well, we're entitled to it. And there's like a fear of saying it's without merit. And here we have women saying, and who have studied it firsthand and through research, it's without merit. And it's not anti-woman.
Really
it's not to say, it's as a legal defense to relieve women of criminal responsibility. In other words, to say that women are not responsible at certain times of the month. There's no evidence that they lose control to that extent.
Nobody's saying women are out of control. In this case, the Santos case, you still have the same burden of proof as in any case. You have to prove beyond a reasonable doubt a criminal act and a criminal intent.
You're not saying it, but the issue is beyond this one case and beyond what you yourself were saying. I think that there's an individual level here, there's a legal level, there's a medical diagnostic level, and certainly I think we would all agree that an individual case must be evaluated specifically, in terms of its own merits. I mean, medical diagnoses are always made specifically to that individual. And then the legal system, brings to bear the issues on that particular case. What I'd like to do is draw our attention to a different level of discussion, which is sociological, really.
Elaine, what do you got? Poor Elaine, okay.
I've been sitting here with, making notes about all of these things because I think it's very important for the perspective of the women's health movement.
Explain what you do within the women's health movement.
To come in here.
And then let's talk about your questions.
Yeah. I currently chair the Women in Health Roundtable, which is a voluntary educational and advocacy organization in Washington, which basically does education around a variety of women's health issues, and this is just one of many that we're extremely interested in. Prior to that, I was program director of the National Women's Health Network, and again, I became involved in a number of these issues. Not literally from a legal standpoint, but in the sense of what does that imply, what does that mean for women? And I think that the larger issue here, and the thing that the women's health movement is grappling with, is how do we reconcile biology with culture? If, you know, it's a classic double bind. If we acknowledge, as we feel it needs to be, that there is a physiological process, and there is absolutely no question in the minds of the women's health movement that there is a syndrome.
And
you
it
only
needs
have to
to be
read,
investigated.
yeah, you only have to read the testimonies or hear the testimonies or look at the information that groups like PMS Action put out to understand that it is very real and very devastating in some instances, not in all. There's a whole continuum. I think that the thing that upsets us is that our experiential and anecdotal evidence is never looked at, and I really respect scientific and epidemiological work and the need for that. But it's very frustrating for us to never have the anecdotal stuff or the experiential stuff validated because we don't get funded to do those kinds of studies. I think at this point what we're dealing with is the whole socialization. How do we recognize this thing and yet not be terribly discriminated against in the workplace, in child custody, in any number of issues that affect our lives as women? It's got to be looked at in the larger political framework, and that's a word that people have got to stop being afraid of. There is a political framework to this. It has tremendous implications for women. And I think one of the reasons that the women's health movement has been grappling so is that they have the notion, I think, that they are responsible for the definitive statement. I mean,
I got that impression.
we as consumer advocates are supposed to be able to say, listen, this is how it is, and that's it, and it sort of becomes gospel, and I think we've taken that role a bit too seriously. I think it's very important to mention the work of Dr. Katarina Dalton in London, who has worked for years and years with vast numbers of women and has treated them successfully with natural progesterone, and I underscore natural because if it's synthetic, it is not going to work and it's not going to be good for you. But unfortunately, she has never done double-blind studies, and it's very, very tragic in my mind because she's done incredibly good work. It's very well documented, but it's not respected in this country. And I think one of the things that that we so often see here is the sort of American ego that if we didn't invent it, it doesn't exist. If we didn't develop it, it's not good enough. If we didn't manufacture it, it's not, you know. And I think in terms of treatment of PMS, that's coming into play. I think that Dr. Dalton's work will be more respected when the double-blind studies that are starting here now do come out. So, you know, I want to say that I think that the question here is to define this, to quantify it, to look at correlation versus causation, but definitely to recognize that it does exist and that it does not debilitate women to the point that they can't control it. But our whole society has not allowed women to be enraged or to do stress reduction. You know, most of us can't say, it's a bad day, can you take care of my kids? I'm going to the pool and work it off, or whatever.
Exactly what's
and
needed.
those are the issues that we in the women's health movement want to do, is to develop support systems, to develop recognition, and to really have it looked at in the larger socio-political context. So that's my big message is let's not talk in absolutes, but look at how do we deal with this situation to the support of women.
Now, Jean, you gave me the name and phone number and address that we're going to flash on the screen in just a few minutes of a doctor at NIMH who will receive letters and phone calls for women who want more information about PMS and about the group PMS Action and the research and all of that. Perhaps if these women would also, and they don't have to just be women, it can be men also writing in who know women who are, you know, disrupting their lives and they're wondering why. They might think that this could be a cause. To write in and say, we want support groups, not just PMS centers, which I understand there is a problem with.
I'd like to say a word about treatment, that I think at this point, the fact that we have so many treatments that work so poorly tells us that we know very little about the syndrome. While it's true that some women respond to certain of the treatments, the problem is that we have in no way been able to predict who will get better on Agent X and who will get worse. So what we've tried is a kind of shotgun approach of medications. And I think progesterone really falls into that kind of shotgun approach. Certainly some women may respond, but some women may get worse, and we just need to clarify. I mean, the whole history of medical progress is being able to predict who's going to do better on what treatment. So we need to do that.
Okay, Jean, thank you. I hope that the NIH study will prove all of these things and help us and get treatment for those of us who do suffer from PMS. For those of you out there, I do suggest that you contacted Dr. Susan Blumenthal, and her name, address, and phone number are on your screen right now, I hope. I thank you, ladies, very, very
Thank you.
much.
Thank you.
You have been so informative. I had questions. I can't honestly say that I know the answers any better now than I did then, but I know that there are people who care and they're causing a commotion, and we will get to the bottom of this. We will find out what is happening with PMS. It might take a few years, but go get yourself some counseling in the meantime.
And
Is
look
that a
at
good
natural
idea?
remedies. Let's not make it a pharmacological crisis.
Exercise.
That's right. That's right.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.